Things darker than man. At 3 a.m. on July 17, 2004, I was at the scene of the 7th murder in the last 4 weeks. My partner, Jim McAllister, and I were the first to respond, witnessing the horrific scene before the forensics and cleanup crews arrived. Following a scattered trail of broken glass, debris, and blood, we found our way to the master bedroom, where we found the victim's bifurcated body, wrapped in tattered cloth and covered in blood-soaked goose feathers. Her name was Sally McMahon. She was a 74-year-old woman who lived alone and, according to neighbors, rarely had visitors. There was no reason for anyone to be running amok in her garden, let alone murdering her. But that's exactly what happened. We had ruled out an animal attack after the autopsy of the first victim, a farmer torn to shreds in his wrecked kitchen. At first, we thought it might be a bear or a ferocious wolf, but then a visibly shaken coroner from the local hospital reported to Sheriff Alverson that the bite marks on the farmer's body were strange. The teeth marks were identified as human, but simultaneously unidentifiable. We all hoped the subsequent cases as they occurred would be different, that they were caused by animals, or that the autopsies would yield different conclusions. But by this 7th case, there were still a few officers stubbornly believing this was the work of a rogue bear. I stood outside the house, smoking, listening to my colleagues chat. The street light above flickered incessantly. The lead detective on the case, Donald Evans, stepped out of the house and approached me, his face ashen even under the pale yellow light. "Officer Lemansky, just call me Michelle." I offered my hand to shake. "You're Detective Evans, right?" He shook it. "That's right. I hear you were one of the first on the scene." "Yes, sir," I replied, the smoke lingering around my mouth. "Look, I know cases like this are rare around here, but I need you to tell me if you or McAllister noticed anything different from the previous scenes." I tried to rack my brain. "We entered the house around 3:10 a.m., noticed an overturned cabinet and broken glass at the foot of the stairs. Upstairs, we found more damaged furniture, broken glass, and a dark red blood trail leading to the master bedroom." My mind was blank. I shrugged. Everything was horrific, but nothing stood out compared to the other cases. "The handprints," I remembered. "There were handprints on the ceiling." "What?" Evans nearly choked. "There were bloody handprints on the walls and the floor, but there were also some on the ceiling." Are you sure they were handprints?" Evans stammered. "As sure as I am that we're talking right now. Bloody handprints, very clear. It wasn't like the assailant threw the victim up there or anything. You can check again if you want," I said coolly. "Okay, hell." Evans turned and hurried back into the house. I looked over at Jim. He was sitting stunned on the hood of his car. I knew the case was weighing on him, but something was clearly turning in his mind. The handprints on the ceiling frightened and confused me. The previous murders were gruesome, but no detail was this bizarre, aside from the lack of fingerprints and the strange bite marks. I was about to talk to Jim when Evans ran back out, looking even paler, almost green. "You were right about the handprints. We're getting samples to identify the culprit," he said, his voice strained. "Okay." I didn't expect much. For the past 3 weeks, all efforts at DNA analysis or blood samples had yielded nothing. Forensics said the body was covered in bite marks. "Human?" I asked. "Maybe. We'll have to wait for the autopsy. Maybe the results will be different. We don't know." He nodded in reply. "We know. We know damn well," Evans said with the same kind of desperate hope as the other officers. But it was becoming clear this couldn't be dismissed. There was someone out there committing these brutal acts, someone slaughtering people savagely for no apparent reason. These were serial killings, but the term serial killer had not yet been used by the sheriff or even by Detective Evans. "You and McAllister can go home," Evans said, his tone authoritative but laced with defeat. "It's been a long night, and the forensics team will be here a while." I wished Evans luck finding more evidence and signaled for Jim to get in the car. As I turned the car around at the end of the street, I looked back at the house, knowing that soon dawn would pull the dark veil off the street and the townspeople would wake up to unanswerable questions. 1 week later, on a slow morning, my tired brain was jolted awake by a phone call while I was sitting at my desk. I didn't recognize the number. "Michelle Lemansky? Who am I speaking with?" I answered coldly. "Hello, Mr. Peterson. I was wondering if you had any additional information regarding the investigation into the series of murders in Taunton." Her words were like a shot of adrenaline straight to my head. I stammered. "Or perhaps any clarifying comments on today's story to publish in the next edition?" She asked as if interrogating me. "How did you know about this? Where did you get my number?" I growled. 3 days ago, we received detailed information about a series of murders in Taunton. Do you read the paper, sir?" As if in response, the latest copy of the Jefferson Herald was angrily slammed down in front of me by Sheriff Alverson. The headline blared arrogantly on the thin paper. "Horror in Taunton, the Sawney Bean Murders." I looked up at Alverson's scowling face, then back to the call. Excuse me for a moment." I immediately hung up and put the phone down. I read the article with a growing sense of disgust, especially at the tactless reference to the Scottish cannibal in the headline. In the early hours of July 17th, Jefferson County Police were called to the scene of a suspected break-in, only to discover a horrific sight: the dismembered and cannibalized body of 74-year-old Sally McMahon. This is believed to be the 7th in a series of similar horrific incidents that authorities have kept quiet to avoid panic among Taunton residents. Glancing further down the page, I saw my name, along with Jim's. I looked up at Alverson, stunned. "What the hell is this?" I yelled. Alverson's cold gaze didn't change. "I was hoping you'd know," he said dryly. My mind raced. I never said anything to the press. I knew this was the kind of news they love to dig up, especially here where nothing ever happens. And one thought flashed in my mind. Jim. He had left his gun and badge on Alverson's desk the day after the 7th murder, and no one had been able to contact him since. I couldn't think of anyone else who could have leaked this whole thing to the press. No one else at the scene, no matter how shocked, had lost control like Jim. Alverson seemed to read my mind. "You think it was McAllister?" "Yes, it seems likely," I replied quickly. "The only other person who could have leaked the info was the one who reported the crime, and we intentionally didn't provide details about the bite marks to her. We also kept those details from previous witnesses. And no one in this dump has heard from him since last week, and no one can reach him." "Does he have family?" the sheriff asked. "No," I replied. "Kids or a girlfriend or anything?" he asked. "He lives alone, Sheriff," I answered, my tone gradually turning cold. Yes, Jim had just left. His personality seemed to melt away day by day since this case opened, and that was completely unlike him. But Alverson was still the same harsh and irresponsible jerk he had always been. In the 8 years I'd worked here, he'd never really tried to understand me or any other colleague, even though he had little else to do. Maybe he was bitter about being fired from a high position in Seattle or something, but that kind of apathy and coldness certainly wouldn't ever get me to tell him my story. I knew what was coming out of his mouth next. "All right, Lemansky, you know the fool better than anyone else here, so you're going to drag him out of whatever hole he's in and talk to him." "With all due respect, Sheriff," I almost choked on the words. "What am I even going to say to him? The press already ran the story." "You tell him whatever is necessary," Alverson interrupted me. "Tell him to go to the Jefferson Herald and tell them forensics made a mistake. This was an animal attack. I can't have those bastards making us look like we're not in control of the situation. So they'll have to retract that damn headline immediately. This is a quiet town, and I don't want the Hoover boys sniffing around here. Cannibalism, Jesus! Alverson was probably the only person in the world still using the term Hoover boys to refer to the FBI after 1969. There was a running joke among the officers about his outdated habits that he was completely unaware of. I jumped up from my desk, not wanting to endure the unanswered what-ifs of the situation. "Sheriff, what if they don't retract the headline? What if they don't issue a correction?" I asked. Alverson, as usual, got angry, looking at me with eyes that showed he was about to explode again. He shook his head, trying to think of some solution. "All right, we'll question every man. No, every person over 16 in Taunton. Send officers door to door, demand everyone over 16 answer questions. Anyone who refuses will be considered an immediate suspect. I can't have the locals thinking we don't have this under control," he said. Everything was about how we looked, not what we were doing. You bastard. Of course, it was important that the people of Taunton felt we were confident and certain in our handling of things, but the truth was, we weren't handling anything. We were blindly dealing with an invisible attacker, and all of us were paralyzed with terror. "Sheriff," I started. "Go find him," he muttered. I was about to argue, but then decided I wouldn't win this verbal spar. Fine. I had tried to contact Jim earlier this week without success, so I knew my only option was to go straight to his house, if he hadn't packed his bags and taken the earliest flight to the East Coast, that is. As Alverson slowly returned to his office, I quickly cleared the messy papers from my desk and went to the parking lot, deciding to take my own car instead of the department's. I felt a weight on my shoulders, as if the hot, humid air was pressing down on me. Jim's sudden disappearance was just another rung on this ladder of stress. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had witnessed and wondered when I would have to face another horrific scene like that again. The dark clouds began to drip as I drove through the downtown area, their gray shapes signaling an approaching storm. Jim lived in an apartment complex about 4 miles from the station, close enough to the edge of town and far enough from the center that hardly anyone cared that the building needed repairs. I had only been there once to give Jim a ride home when his car was in the shop, but it wasn't hard to find. The raindrops hammered against the outside of my car, the metallic sound echoing continuously as if I were trapped in a tin can at a shooting range. I pulled into the parking lot and reached for my jacket, which had slipped from the seat to the floor. In my head, I thought about what I would say to Jim. That is, if he hadn't locked himself in the bathroom and, that wasn't a thought I wanted to spend much time imagining. I got out of the car and walked quickly to the apartment complex door, pressed Jim's room number on the panel next to the door and hit call, while the raindrops greedily clung to my shoes. "Jim, it's me, Michael. If you're there, open up. I'm not here to drag you back to see Alverson. I just want to talk," I yelled. No answer from the machine. Looking at the parking lot, I saw Jim's car parked under the shadow of a tall pine tree. I tried calling again, this time letting my annoyance show. "Jim, I know you're in there. This past week has been terrible for everyone on this case, but I need to talk to you. Besides, it's pouring out here, and I'm freezing to death. Open the door," I desperately shouted one more time. The transceiver crackled, and a hoarse voice came from the speaker. "Michelle? My God, come up." I opened the door and didn't bother with the elevator. I ran up to the second floor and walked quickly down the hall to his room. The door was ajar, the safety latch resting against the frame. I had just knocked twice when Jim pulled the door open, eyes wide, a pistol in his right hand. Holy shit, I recoiled, seeing the barrel pointed straight at my face. Jim lowered the gun and said, breathless, his voice choked, "I had to make sure it was you, Mike. You heard my voice through the—" "Whatever," I said, flustered by Jim's obvious paranoia, but not wanting to make him feel worse. "It's me, Jim, it's me. What the hell is this?" I asked, pointing at the gun. "You better come in," he said. I followed Jim into the apartment. The dim light. I had thought it would be much messier, but it wasn't. No leftover food boxes scattered on the floor or piled up, and no unpleasant smell wafting from the kitchen. However, Jim had clearly been drinking. On the coffee table was a quarter-full bottle of cognac, next to a cheap-looking whiskey glass. "How long have you been drinking this?" I asked, laughing faintly. "A few days, I guess. It's strong. You want some?" His words slurred like a tree in the wind. "I don't need it, Jim. I'll get straight to the point. I just came from the station. I saw the newspaper, and Alverson needs you to contact the Jefferson Herald to get them to retract the headline." "Fuck Alverson." Those were not words slurred by drunkenness. They were firm, calm, and serious. Fuck Alverson and his cold-hearted bastard ways. He's handled this case like a blind mole in a gunfight. I don't even dare to report what I found to him, because he'd throw me in jail before I could finish the story. And believe me, Mike, I found something. Some real goddamn weird shit. "What did you find?" I asked, confused. "You're going to think I'm just a drunk who lost control after seeing too much gore. But you're my best friend here, and I believe you'll listen to me," he said calmly, his voice thick. "I'm listening. First, yes, I gave that information to the Herald, and there's no way I'm asking them to retract the article. No one here is safe, and they need to know what's happening so they can take the best precautions possible. The killer has no connection to the victims. Anyone could be next," he began. "Wait, you think you know who the killer is?" I interrupted. Jim looked at me with a cold, sincere gaze. The blood in my veins felt like it was freezing as belief washed over me. Jim was completely serious. In my mind, logic and imagination were fighting fiercely, and imagination seemed to be winning. "Jim," I said through anxious breaths, "you know who the killer is? If so, how did you find out?" "I'm not a detective, Mike. Hell, I'm barely a decent cop, but I think I have a few clues," he replied. I urged him on. "Go on." Jim poured another small glass of cognac, then continued. "I used to frequent a bar downtown, the Foxhole, you know it. There's a retired park ranger who always comes on Friday nights. He has a dozen stories from his working days, and we'd sit around listening to him. One night, I remember it was about 6 months ago, he told a story he said was his last assignment before retiring. It happened last year. A group of 6 hikers got lost deep in the woods at Mount Pilchuck State Park, went off the trail, probably intentionally. Only 2 came back, a woman named Estelle Palmer and a man named Reuben Grandy. When the rangers found them, Grandy was in bad shape, dazed, and said he didn't know where the other 4 had gone, that they had wandered off into the night. Here's the weirder part. Palmer said that the night before they were found, there were still 3 of them, I think one more man. Palmer was half asleep and swore she saw Grandy follow the other man into the woods when he went to pee or something. The man didn't come back, but Grandy returned 10 minutes later. She said that Grandy looked different, gaunt, taller, and insisted that there was blood around his mouth. She was terrified and pretended to be asleep. Of course, her story was dismissed, assuming she was delirious. There was something about this story that really scared me in a way none of his others ever had. Then the old man added the kicker. A week later, the U.S. Forest Service found partial remains in the woods with what were believed to be human bite marks, but they were too mangled to identify who they belonged to. Grandy and Palmer were both re-interviewed, but nothing came of it. Palmer even told the exact same story, insisting she knew what she saw, but she was ignored again. I told the old guy before the bar closed that night that he'd scared the hell out of me, but I didn't believe him. He just looked at me blankly and said, "Look it up, son." So I did. And you know what? It actually happened. There are plenty of different sources covering it. It really happened. But on our side, you barely saw anything. Right, I began. But Mount Pilchuck State Park is huge. The surrounding area is... Reuben Grandy lives in Taunton, Mike. He owns a farm. Jim rummaged through the messy papers on the coffee table. Estelle Palmer used to live in Taunton too, just a quarter mile from Grandy. She lived here her whole life from what I read. "Is this a police report?" I asked. Jim shot me an annoyed look and continued. "The point is, after returning from that trip, she moved 4 towns over, packed up and left within a week, sold the house she grew up in to someone who'd wanted to buy it for years, her childhood home. From what I read, Grandy must be responsible for the disappearance of those other people. She witnessed something in those woods that made it unbearable to be near him anymore. Logic still tried to gain the upper hand in the battle in my mind. It was trying its best, but the blade of superstition was too sharp. Maybe she was paranoid, I said. You know, small-town folk lived in one place her whole life. And a clean health record, Jim declared, waving a crumpled medical file in my face, clearly taken from a local clinic. No history of schizophrenia, depression, borderline personality disorder, or even a single panic attack. No prescription drugs. Obviously, it's possible we could attribute what she saw to starvation, dehydration, or even the delayed effects of a bad trip. But the fact is, this woman left just days after the incident, and Ton isn't exactly next door to Mount Pilchuck. Jim dropped the medical file on the floor and tremblingly pulled up another document. He was excited, or scared, or both. Listen, her new address is in May Creek. Jim, you're chasing a wild goose chase, I said. If we bring this to Alverson, he'll call us idiots and then we hire me just to fire me again. If we bring it to Evans, he'll think we're running after some nonsense because he's only used to dealing with professional criminals in Seattle or petty break-ins. He's probably only been in the industry for 2 or 3 years. Admit it, Mike, our superiors are clueless, and maybe we actually have a lead. I know it sounds crazy, I know it's a long shot, and it's stupid luck that I heard that story, but we might have a real suspect. At that moment, the haunting connection of Jim's details confused me. I couldn't think straight. So, you're saying the killer is Reuben Grandy? Jim blurted out, maybe I'm just a drunk guy pretending to be a great detective, and maybe I'm completely wrong, but if there's even a small chance I'm right, we have to do something. Jim was right, even in his frenzy. Alverson didn't care, and Evans, though leading the investigation, was being eaten alive by his own fear. I saw it lurking behind his eyes the night of Sally McMahon's murder. All right, what's the plan? We go to May Creek to see Estelle Palmer and ask her about Grandy, Jim said, his breath trembling. Ask about what he was like, if he changed during or after the hike, all of it. If we can convince her to help, maybe we have a chance to report back to Evans. Or she'll chase us off her property with a double-barreled shotgun for daring to ask. You're always so negative, Jim retorted. I burst out laughing. Change into some clean clothes, sober up, and we'll go to May Creek. An hour later, Jim and I arrived at Estelle Palmer's residence in May Creek, after having to turn back several times because of the exhausted GPS in my car. We parked across from Palmer's house, number 5 Fairbanks Street. The place was nothing like I had imagined. I thought I'd see an overgrown lawn full of tall weeds, a flimsy porch leading up to a dirty stoop with a dusty screen door. Maybe there'd be a plaque nailed to the plywood wall with "Strangers will be shot," scrawled in red paint. But it wasn't like that at all. In fact, the place looked no different from the other peaceful homes in May Creek. The lawn was lush green, every blade of grass seemingly trimmed evenly, and right by the curb was a toy truck that definitely belonged to a child. Jim brushed his hair out of his eyes and opened the car door. All right, we're either going to get answers or get a door slammed in our faces. We approached the door. I glanced through the living room window and saw a woman sitting in an armchair watching a young boy, about 3 years old, playing on the floor. She looked up as Jim rang the doorbell, stood up, left the living room, and signaled for the boy to stay put. Estelle Palmer opened the door with a flash of annoyance in her eyes. She looked to be in her late 30s, with dull blonde, shoulder-length hair. Noticing her irritation, I began to speak. "Miss Palmer." "It's Miss. I'm not married," Estelle replied. "Right, Miss Palmer," Jim picked up. "I'm Jim McAllister, and this is Michael Lemansty. We don't want to bother you. We're police?" she cut in. Jim looked clearly surprised. "I guessed as much. Where are you from? Sultan? Don't tell me Seattle." "Taunton," I said. Her eyes narrowed even more. "We understand you used to live there," I said. Right, but what's that got to do with you? She sounded more defensive. We came here to ask about... Jim fumbled for the words, even though he fully expected the cold reception. Miss Palmer's annoyance peaked. She started to close the door. Reuben Grandy, Jim finally got out. She stopped and looked through the gap between the door and the frame. The irritation vanished, replaced by a look of worry. "Come in," she finally said, inviting us into the house. The interior of the house was as beautiful as the outside. The staircase was decorated with paintings of famous North American mountains. The kitchen was neat and clean. Estelle led us into the living room, where the little boy, I assumed her son, looked up at us with the curious, innocent eyes typical of a young child. "Honey, go play in your room, okay?" Estelle said to the boy. He looked down at the plastic dinosaur he was playing with, then at his mom, then picked up the toy and walked slowly down the hall. Before Jim or I could compliment how cute the boy was, the worried look returned to her face. "I haven't seen Reuben in over a year," she said. "When I moved here, he used to call my cell 5 times a week until I changed my number. Of course, I didn't tell him I moved here. What did he do?" "It's not what he did, but what we think he might have done." "Miss Palmer," Jim started. "Just call me Estelle," she said, more gently, seemingly no longer as annoyed as a few minutes ago. "Estelle," Jim said, "here's the situation. I have reason to believe Reuben Grandy might be involved in a series of violent serial murders in Taunton. But this is just a hunch, and the police investigation so far has been a mess, so we need your help. From what I understand, you've known Reuben for most of your life." Estelle sat down in the armchair and gestured for us to sit on the sofa. "Since childhood, yes. His father, Scott, owned the farm on the road near my old house, and he inherited the whole place when Scott passed away. We were in the same class in high school. He was always a smart guy, knew a lot about the world, knew a lot about nature, and cared deeply about the livestock he raised on the farm. Could name every tree in the woods." She smiled faintly at the memory. "Throughout your childhood, did he ever seem strange in any way?" I asked. "No, never. I never thought of him as an outcast or weirdo. Everyone in high school loved Reuben." "I need to ask about the hiking trip. 4 people went missing and only you and Reuben returned. A week later, you moved. What happened?" Estelle's voice trembled. She spoke, fear mixed with anxiety in her eyes. "Reuben, he changed during that trip. We had been gone for a week, and it was clear something strange had happened to him. Normally, he'd be talking about conifers and mountain lions, but he barely said anything. And when he did, his voice was halting and hoarse, as if he'd forgotten his own language. He seemed annoyed when we tried to talk. He didn't say much, but when he did..." Her voice caught again. I leaned forward. "What did he say, Estelle?" He said he was hungry," she replied. A jolt ran down my spine. The silence rang in my ears like the echo after an explosion. "I heard him at night," she continued. "He sat by the fire longer than anyone and muttered to himself, saying things like, 'Oh, I'm so hungry,' in a voice I'd never heard from him before. When we realized we were lost, that's when people started to disappear. First Becca, then Miguel, then Ruth, and finally Nick. The night before we were found, when Nick disappeared, I saw Reuben follow him into the woods. I didn't hear anything, but Reuben came back later without Nick. He looked different, gaunt, pale, strangely taller, and I swear to God, he was covered in blood." I glanced at Jim, who was watching Estelle intently. My God, this drunken fool, he might actually be onto something. "Maybe I was delirious," she continued. "Maybe I was. The next day when the Rangers found us, he looked normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still in danger. He kept talking in that same hoarse, cracked voice. The police didn't bother, assuming it was the result of dehydration, and dismissed my story as a hallucination. As soon as I got home, I moved immediately. I lived with my mother in Olympia for a short time, before finding a place here in May Creek. Like I said, maybe I was crazy. I'm not saying Reuben Grandy definitely killed those people, but I believe something in those woods entered him and took up residence, and I don't think it ever left. Jim shifted from intense focus to slight confusion. What do you mean, something? Estelle laughed nervously, as if ashamed. I'm not the type to believe in folklore, Mr. McAllister. Never have been, even when my father tried to scare me with it as a child. But Reuben was Reuben until that trip, and he changed suddenly. Call it what you want. A spirit, a disease, the call of the wild, whatever. Something took Reuben. I'm not saying if you investigate him you'll definitely find the answer, but maybe you should try. Noticing Estelle was close to tears, I put my hand on Jim's arm and said, "Thank you so much for your help. We should go and let you be." Estelle, Jim hesitated. "I don't think we could convince you to come with us." "No," she interrupted. "I can't see Reuben again. Not after what I saw in those woods. He doesn't know where I live, but I still lock every door and window at night. I still check my security cameras every morning. Sometimes I think if I saw him again, maybe I could put the ghosts in my mind to rest. But something tells me those ghosts are stubborn. I can't put myself in that situation. I'm the only thing Robert has." She motioned toward the end of the hallway where her son's room was. Jim looked like he wanted to argue, but quickly relented. "Thank you for your time, Estelle. Honestly," Jim said as we stood up and walked to the door. "We're going to see Reuben, and we're going to find out who did this, I promise." "Thank you," Estelle replied. "Good luck." She quietly watched us walk down the driveway to the car, her eyes filled with a solemn look. Maybe she was reliving all those memories. Or maybe she thought she had just pushed us deeper into something we'd regret getting involved in. I looked back at the house one last time as I started the car. Through the living room window, I saw Estelle's blurred shadow tightly hugging her son in a gentle embrace. We drove away. I parked in front of the Taunton police station at 6:15 p.m. after convincing an irritated Jim to stop there first. I told him to wait in the car while I quickly went in to talk to Alverson. Clearly, he was at least doing a good job of summoning the locals for questioning, as I had to push through a crowd of townspeople gathered outside and inside the station. I ran to Alverson's office and knocked hard on the door. "Who is it?" a rough, angry voice called out. I opened the door and met the cross-eyed gaze of Sheriff Alverson. "Where have you been, Lemansky? Have you questioned a man named Reuben Grandy yet?" "Who?" asked Alverson. "Reuben Grandy, the farmer north of Taunton." "How should I know?" Alverson said, taking a bitter sip of coffee. "Officer Barnett has the list. Go ask her. And did you convince McAllister to retract that article?" I slammed his office door shut and ran to the front desk where Officer Barnett was busy with an Excel spreadsheet. I nearly slammed into the desk, startling her. "Eve," I exhaled deeply, "have you questioned a man named Reuben Grandy?" Clearly confused by my urgency, she opened the list and scanned it for about 10 seconds. Looks like we questioned him a few hours ago. He was cleared as a suspect," she replied. "God, where's Detective Evans?" I asked. "Monroe," she answered vaguely. "A call from another case, so he left a few hours ago." "How long did you keep Grandy in the interrogation room?" I asked, my voice urgent. 5 minutes, in and out," Barnett replied. "Damn it! They didn't even ask him about the hiking trip." "Thanks." I rushed out of the station feeling the confused eyes of the townspeople fixed on me. Jim was sitting in the car, nervously looking around as I ran toward it. I opened the door and jumped in. "They let him go 2 hours ago. Evans is in Monroe. We're going to Grandy's," I yelled. "Let's go," Jim said. His voice was thick with obvious anxiety. He had anticipated this, but now the reality was making him uneasy. Fear began to rise beneath my adrenaline-fueled excitement. The sun was starting its tired descent behind the distant mountains, painting the remaining clouds crimson. The smell of anxiety wafted through the passenger side window crack. With every bit the sun sank in, I started wishing I had more time to get to Grandy's farm. Anything to delay the growing sense of unease in my stomach. "What's Evans doing in Monroe?" Jim asked, clearly trying to break the silence. "Barnett said it was another case. True or not, I don't know, and I don't care. He's scared to death, and not being here means he's useless," I replied. "And Alverson?" he asked. "He didn't even bother bringing people in for interviews," I replied quickly. "Just asked me about convincing the Herald to retract the article. Forget it. We're on our own, Jim." As I finished speaking, the row of houses on North Avenue disappeared, and Grandy's farm came into view, less than 400 meters away. I could see a small, neat one-story house at the head of a large 2 or 3 acre lot. I guessed it all belonged to Grandy. In the pasture, herds of cattle were grazing, and behind the house a tall barn stood proudly amidst the rustic scenery. Trying to calm myself, Jim and I parked at the end of the gravel road, preparing for what would hopefully be the last stop of the day. We walked up to the front door, a sense of unease hanging like a blade in the gentle summer breeze. I knocked on the screen door and squinted through the glass. From the end of the hall, a man about 6'4", 1.93 meters, appeared. He ran slowly toward the door and opened it, full of excitement. His skin was tanned as one would expect from a farmer. He wore ripped jeans and a polo shirt, looking to be in his late 30s. His thinning brown hair revealed tangled clumps under an ill-fitting baseball cap, and he had a light red beard. He smiled, his eyes twinkling with something. "What can I do for you?" Grandy asked. His voice was a raspy, yet cheerful melody. I was momentarily confused. I had expected a gaunt, emaciated man wearing a wide-brimmed hat covering his face. I had expected a hoarse voice, difficult to hear. I had also expected him to tell us to get lost. Jim quickly spoke up. "I'm Detective Cal Mariano, and this is Detective Dave Crawley. We're here to conduct the town-wide interrogation with the residents of Taun." Grandy laughed awkwardly, his brow furrowing. "Ah, right. There must be some mistake. The police already interviewed me a few hours ago." "We understand, sir, and we apologize for the bother," I said, joining Jim's Detective Crawley persona. "You see," Jim said, "this is a massive operation, and the Taun Police Department is overwhelmed, as you can imagine. Unfortunately, they missed a few key questions when interviewing some people, and they sent us to fill in the details." "Oh, right. Of course," Grandy said, his expression softening a bit. "Come on in." Jim and I stepped into the hallway as Grandy closed the door. The temperature inside was quite cool, but there was an unpleasant odor lingering in the air. I heard the door lock behind me. Was the door already locked? I couldn't remember clearly. "Pardon the smell," he laughed. "I'm having a rat problem, and the damn things keep dying in the walls and under the floor. I'm trying to clean up the smell as best I can until I can dig them out." "Right, I understand," I said, feigning sympathy. "I had a rat problem a month ago." Grandy led us into the kitchen, which seemed to be the largest and most impressive room in the small house, with a granite-topped kitchen island spanning the length of the room and a modern oven in the center. On the island was a large pile of raw meat. "My God," I remarked, "is this all from your cattle?" "Sure is," Grandy said with pride. "All from this farm. The butcher shops downtown love this stuff." "I'll bet," I said. "Now, Mr. Grandy, do you mind if Detective Mariano and I ask you a few questions? It shouldn't take long, okay?" "Have a seat," Grandy said, gesturing toward the kitchen island. He leaned against it, focusing on the meat. He hadn't even asked to see our badges. "I'm listening. Ask away," he said. "Stetton records show your interview only lasted about 5 minutes, correct?" I asked. "Right. In and out quick. I think they skipped me because, well, I don't have a criminal record, and, I mean, look at this place. I'm busy all the time. No kids to help on the farm," Grandy replied. "Of course, regarding criminal charges, your record is completely clean, Mr. Grandy." "Yep," he replied. Grandy picked up a meat cleaver and began chopping the meat. The blade fell with a heavy thud, separating a portion of the meat. I guess we're here to ask about the hiking trip you took in April 2003 with 5 other people. Grandy let out a loud breath, as if he were sighing, but he didn't turn around or stop what he was doing. The blade fell again, this time louder. "Oh, of course. I was a bit surprised they didn't ask," he replied. "All right, starting with a general question. What happened? What's your story?" We got lost on the 6th day of the trip. We originally planned for the trip to be long, but we ended up having trouble finding the base of Mount Pilchuck and got lost in the woods, not knowing which way to go. Becca disappeared on the first night we were lost." Grandy paused, lost in memory for a moment. "Did you know Becca well?" Jim asked. "Since high school. We were supposed to get married this year." His voice was full of pain. "It's not this guy. Damn it, wrong." "I'm so sorry," I said. "That must have been difficult." I was cut off by the gruesome thud of the cleaver on the cutting board, neatly slicing through another piece of meat. This time, the sound was much louder than before. "Right. I try not to think about it. After that, everything became blurry, very blurry. There was a pain. It sounded like he was struggling through every word." "What pain?" I asked. "It started in my head, blurred my vision," he replied. "How long did the pain last?" Jim asked. The electric shock feeling I'd had in Estelle's living room suddenly came alive again. This time, it was like a blade with serrated teeth running down my spine. I thought I had gotten used to the smell of dead rats, but this was something else, something much bitterer. "Hope you'll forgive the smell." 2 days. It spread to my hands and feet, and then they went numb, and then I guess I felt fine, Grandy said. His voice suddenly became strange, hissing through every word. He slammed the cleaver down again. The shrill sound this time was accompanied by a wet, tearing sound of flesh. Grandy turned to look at us. He looked paler than before, his posture slightly hunched. The sparkle in his eyes was gone. "What do you remember about Nick's disappearance the night before you were rescued?" I asked. He paused, setting the cleaver down. "Did I pass out?" His cheekbones were now deeply hollowed, his eyes darker. His fingers were unnaturally long and thin. An eerie silence mingled with tension enveloped the kitchen. "At first, it was just animals." His voice was hoarse, sick. "What?" I yelled. "When I got back from the trip, it was just animals. Coyotes, mountain lions, prairie dogs, not my cattle." "What the hell are you talking about?" My mouth was dry. The odor of decomposition was overwhelming, impossible to ignore. "It was just animals until the feeling came back. There's something in those woods, boys, something that called me, something that wouldn't let me die, something that told me." Grandy's voice was no longer a hoarse hiss. It was like a ghostly moan, as if his voice was caught in a fierce wind. His eyes were black as cold pits. His teeth were abnormally long, sharp yellow fangs that made his face look like it was sneering. Jim stood up abruptly, backing away. "What did it tell you, Mr. Grandy?" Jim asked. "Something told me to eat," Grandy said. The last word, despite the unnatural voice, was cold and clipped. "I killed the people on that hiking trip. I knew all of them, and I killed them. Ate them. Oh, God. Oh, God." Estelle was right. There was no logical explanation for what at first seemed like just a crazy hunch. We were 2 idiots who had stumbled into something far beyond our abilities. "Why? Why?" Jim could barely speak. "I tried eating animals, raw meat, until the feeling came back. That's when I started breaking into other people's houses. People who didn't know, people I knew. Some I liked, some I didn't care about. I tore them all apart." I stood up and staggered back next to Jim as Reuben Grandy advanced towards us, his sharp fangs bared. "Why are you telling us this?" Jim yelled. "Because," his cold voice gradually softened, "now they can do whatever they want with me. They can put me in the electric chair or lock me up in a mental hospital like another criminal lunatic. Because they think they can control me like those other guys who kill young girls just because their mothers were too strict. It helps them sleep better at night, thinking those sick bastards are just human and can be controlled one way or another. But the rage in me, this strength, a thick line of saliva dripped from his mouth onto the floor. There are things in this world darker than man, boys. In the earth, in the mountains, in the woods, or some dark corner of a big city. Maybe you feel better believing that humans are the cruelest thing this life can bring, but I'm afraid that's not true. Grandy's mouth widened unnaturally. Inside were sharp, pointed teeth. There was nothing human in him anymore. At the center of his dark eyes was a small spark of light, like a tiny bright star in the heart of a black hole. The hunger. Jim and I dove in opposite directions as Grandy lunged straight at both of us. A bestial roar erupted from his throat. I heard a chair crash into the kitchen island as I scrambled to my feet, facing the creature that was, or still was, Reuben Grandy. All my disbelief now had no reason to be defended. This nightmare was right in front of me, very, very real. Just as he opened his mouth again, letting out another monstrous groan from within, a gunshot rang out, and Grandy doubled over in pain, howling with the intensity of 1,000 ghosts. Jim stood behind him, his pistol drawn. Grandy convulsed violently, making a horrific cracking sound as if one of his bones had broken. Without hesitation, Grandy leaped from the floor to the ceiling and scrambled down the hallway leading to a door, which I assumed was the basement stairs, moving like an insect. His horrifying shrieks echoed through the house like another angry wind. Jim and I drew our weapons and immediately gave chase. The basement door was wide open, and any pleasant aroma left in the house was now completely overpowered by a distinct tomb-like airflow. This wasn't the smell of dead rats, that's for sure. For about 10 seconds, the whole house was filled with crashing and screaming from the basement. But then, all at once, it fell silent. Deadly silent. I exchanged a horrified glance with Jim. "I wish I was still drunk," Jim mumbled, his voice trembling. We cautiously descended the stairs leading to the basement, the light growing dimmer with every step. I gripped my gun so tightly my knuckles turned white and my palms were slick with sweat. Jim fumbled in his jacket pocket, pulled out a flashlight, turned it on, and illuminated the thick blackness ahead. The beam cut through the darkness, creating a tunnel of light that led us to what I had feared from the moment I smelled that odor. The basement floor was littered with body parts, both animal and human. Limbs, organs, some clearly just dragged down here days ago, while others had decomposed over weeks, maybe even months, left on the ground without a proper burial. A scraping sound from the left caught our attention, and Grandy stepped into view. His transformed state was even more horrifying. He was over 7 feet tall, his chest caved in as if his skin was vacuum sealed. His face was now completely inhuman, his eyes like hollow pits, and his fangs like battle-scarred weapons. Reuben Grandy stood precariously like a demonic statue atop his gruesome trophies, a king of the dead amidst his hall of treasures. He spoke, his voice a deep, guttural growl mixed in a choked-up voice. "Sorry, the fridge down here is broken." A sick smile spread across his face, and that alone was enough to push Jim and me over the edge. We started firing and kept firing until both our guns were completely empty. When the muzzle flashes no longer obscured our vision, the flashlight beam fell on what appeared to be the lifeless corpse of the monster Reuben Grandy had become. We were both stunned. He should have tried to escape the basement, or at least jumped aside. But now the twisted monster lay motionless among the bodies it had hunted. The entire Taunton police force was on the scene half an hour later, and Detective Evans, his face pale and panicked, arrived half an hour after that. The whole cleanup operation took nearly a full week, but that first night was a horrifying ordeal even for those who didn't have to clean up the bodies or witness the creature that caused this. If this were any other case, I would have reveled in the look of horror on Sheriff Alverson's face as he realized how badly he had handled everything, and the realization that he would have to face the damn Hoover boys when a black SUV waited outside the scene. The expression on his face was exactly the same as everyone else's when they had to accept the reality that the nearly 8-foot monster being dragged out of the basement was once Reuben Grandy. I was relieved the case was closed, but I felt no sense of peace. Jim and I had faced the unknown, and it had left memories in our minds that would never be forgotten. There are things out there darker than man. Things we can't control the way we control the likes of Dahmer or John Wayne Gacy. We might have ended Reuben Grandy's insatiable hunger, but whatever was inside him is still slithering through the mountains, looking for another host to infect. The burning rage it carries. I'm not sure we can always fight what we don't understand.